talking about the spiritual core today, and this is the result of an email that I received, and I subtitled it "The Value of a User-Friendly Name," and that is a user-friendly name for the soul, or the Christ, or the spiritual essence that we are. And the question is, what in your way of thinking is the difference between the term soul and Unity's use of the Christ within? And I responded to this individual from a quote from the Complete Soul. "The soul is eternal, unaffected by our ever-changing beliefs, moods, and the perpetually shifting sands of daily thinking. The soul is the spiritual core that we associate with the Christ, that image likeness of God that is already complete, no evolution required. It is that deeper essence that survives when there is no more need for a hat and boots." And that's a reference to a quote from Walt Whitman that says he's more than what's contained between his hat and his boots. So when I use the word soul, I'm using it in the same way that I have learned through my Unity training to use the word Christ, the term Christ. And so in further discussion, the person said, "Why would you drop the use of the term Christ?" And I really haven't dropped it, and I've always been fairly comfortable with it because I made that transition. When I say the word Christ, I know what it means to me. It's that inner reality, that the soul, the spiritual essence that we are. But I said over the years, one of the biggest questions, one of the most frequent questions that have been asked is, what do you mean by Christ? What most people mean by Christ is what? What do we think of when we say the word? We usually think of Jesus, don't we? And so I looked it up on the internet, just how do people think of soul? How do people think of Christ? So when you do a search on soul, they come up with the spiritual or immaterial part of the human being or animal regarded as immortal. Anybody having trouble with that? You know, we say, I have a soul, and that's how we're thinking. Does the soul survive the death of the body? You know, that's most of us grew up in a traditional perspective that acknowledges the soul. The materialist does not acknowledge a soul necessarily. It acknowledges some level of being, but that which we are is generated by the brain in the mind of many. And that's actually being taught or assumed in a lot of ways. But if you have a religious, spiritual background at all, you probably are familiar with this idea of the soul, and it's what we think, the soul of an individual. If you talk about the soul of a song, the soul of a singer, you're talking about the heart, you know, the essence. And when we speak of the soul in a spiritual sense for ourselves, we assume that we survive the death of the body. And the question then is, as I grew up in the Baptist church, what becomes of the soul? Do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? But the soul survives. And if you embrace the idea of hell, then you probably would wish your soul didn't survive. Because, you know, eternity, your soul would live on forever. It's immortal, but it would be a punishment. And as long as you embrace that kind of idea, then that's something it's a good reason to walk the straight and narrow. And it's why fundamentalist churches are so much fuller than we are, because people respond to fear. And they respond to, I've never really thought through that idea that God of love could never condemn you to an eternity in hell. But that's the belief. So when you ask the general public, what is soul, they're going to give you a definition something like this that we find. And then you do the same thing. Look up the word Christ. And what we come up with is the title, also treated as a name given to Jesus of Nazareth. So when we think of Christ in you, can we say that without associating it with this man that lived some 2,000 years ago? Is that possible? When we think of our own spiritual path, and we say, I need to evolve or bring forth the Christ, can I do this without associating it with something in the past, without associating it with history? Can I see it as my experience? And I think that's the biggest problem with terminology. If I think of my soul, even if I'm thinking of soul evolution or soul development, which I stopped thinking about, but I can see it as that's mine. I have a soul, so I can own that. But can I own the Christ? I have a more difficult time. I have to think about that, what that means. And as I said, my training, that's all it was. It was all about the inner Christ, and I have no qualms with that phrase, but a lot of people do. A lot of people use the word Christ as the name for Jesus, period. They say Christ did this, Christ did that, and they're talking about the man that lived 2,000 years ago. So it's terminology, but it doesn't change the reality of the nature of what we are at the spiritual level. And so I have always encouraged you to find your own name, find your own way to address it, because you're addressing you. What we are looking for in terms of the soul is us. And one of the illustrations I gave along with this explanation in the email was, just imagine that you live in a room like this. You've never been out in the sunlight. All you know is the light that is in this room, incandescent light or fluorescent or LEDs or whatever kind of light, artificial light. But you've heard about this thing called the sun. And there's a whole library, and it's full of books that talk about the sun. It's a concept, and you can imagine it's sort of like the light that you're seeing in this room, but it's different. It's grander. But you've never experienced it, so you don't really know. But what you're told by the teachers of the incandescent light, the artificial light, is that if you study enough, if you read about the sun long enough, you'll get it. You'll begin to understand that sunlight is much different, much more powerful, much more, it's indescribable compared to the light that you're used to. So one day you happen to notice, you look at one of the windows and you see a sun beam breaking through, just a tiny spear of light, and you decide to go over and look directly into that beam of light, and you see this blazing something. You can't look at it very long. But you see, and you know, this light source outside of this building is much more profound than what you know as light. And so that gives you an idea that, and what happens in that moment is you say, I don't need to read about the sun anymore. I've experienced it. And maybe I've just touched the hem of the garment. But it is different than anything I've read in a book, anything I have imagined. It's beautiful. And I just got a glimpse of it. So I start thinking, there's a door over there. Maybe if I learn how to go through that door, I can actually go out in the sun. And all of these books full of information about the sun have no meaning. And the teachers that are telling me I must read more, I must evolve my understanding. So what changes your understanding? It's the dropping the labels, dropping the use of words, and having a direct experience. The moment we have a direct experience, even if we experience a tiny glimmer of sunlight, we are suddenly enlightened by something that is beyond all this head information. We have an actual experience. And this is the problem that we run into with terminology. It fills our books. It's a way to communicate, but you cannot communicate direct experience. This is the problem I think Jesus had. He was trying to tell people what he was going through at an inner level, this kingdom within. But they were hearing it as information about the Son. That's what the whole religious thing is based on, information about the Son. And you've got all this priesthood they're experts in information about the Son. Not one of them has experienced the Son, but they're experts in the information about the Son. So they say, here's the terminology that you use. So we get lost in the terminology. We think if we learn all the terminology, we read all the books, then our souls will be advanced. The whole time, the sun is shining in its full brightness. Nothing has to evolve. The only thing that has to evolve is I've got to stop saying, I believe this library full of books is my source of knowledge. I move from believing that to understanding that little beam of light coming through the window is the way, the truth, and the life. And when I have that experience, and it's an intuitive thing, it's not a head thing, it's not an intellectual apprehension, it's an intuitive exposure. When that occurs, then the prophecy that Jesus referred to from Psalms, and they shall all be taught by God, is fulfilled. We no longer believe, we know. And it doesn't really matter what kinds of words you put on it. I like to refer to God as the creative life force because it's an action that is occurring all the time, and it is a living thing. It is a force. It is creative. But if somebody says God is creative, we think of God as an old man up in the sky creating the universe and doing all that stuff. Our minds shoot back to conceptualize. We get away from the intuitive experience. But the spiritual thing is intuitive. There's no amount of knowledge, no amount of information you can put into your head that's going to tip the balance for you to experience sunlight. That doesn't exist. One of our old Unity teachers said that most people are overread and underdone. We have a lot of information, but do we have any experience? And that's what we're after. So that's why we encourage meditation, and the person also said that they didn't recall in their early years in Unity hearing much about meditation, about the importance of it. It's because the head stuff is the low-hanging fruit. It's very easy to read a book about sunlight and grasp the concepts. It's not the same as becoming still, trying to still the mind enough to get that little sliver of light through the window, that little experience. But that little experience of direct sunlight will teach you more in 5 seconds than reading all the books on all the shelves. We're waiting for that next author to show up. And we all have our favorites, our favorite books. They stir in us an inspiration. But that inspiration is not the same. It's like looking at a picture of a sunset. It's very inspiring. But it's not like being in the sunset. And that's what we want. We want the direct experience. And so that little experience of that ray of light through the window, it shows us how sunlight works through direct experience. It's not a concept. There's no words. It's a knowing, a direct impartation. And that's what this inner thing is, the soul, the Christ, call it whatever you want, whatever you're comfortable with. The spiritual essence of each one of us is pushing out, pushing forward all the time. And it's like the shade is kind of blowing and a little bit of light comes through and we get glimpses of it. So we follow that, and it's a challenge to do that because, as I've talked about many times, you sit down to close your eyes and be still. We don't understand the value of doing that because we haven't maybe experienced that glimmer of sunlight. But we need just that one experience, that one little thing. And then we're on the path. We know where to go next. Once we see it, once we experience it, and by seeing, I mean seeing with the mind, with the heart, then we follow that. We're truly on the spiritual path. Filling our heads with information is a form of the spiritual path, but it's like a precursor. As I also talk about in one of the books, it's like walking up to the edge of the river, and we want to be on the other side of the river. We want to cross that busy mind, that river, the busy mind. But what we have is we have a whole bunch of shrines on the edge of the river that talk about what life on the other side is like. That's our church. That's our Bibles. That's our religious indoctrination. We camp out on the bank of the river. The object is to get into the river and swim across, to get across that busyness of mind, and then we experience the sunlight. We get outside, and we are taught by God, taught through direct knowledge. If you think that God is this old man that is directing you, that's one way to think of it, and there's value to that. That, I really screwed my life up, and so I need help from the divine. So I turn my life over to God. And it's like I'm turning my life over to this wise old man. And that is probably better than turning your life over to yourself, when you're in a dysfunctional state of mind. But that's not what we're after. That's not the ultimate that we're after. We want to begin to experience the sunlight directly, so we know what we're talking about. We know what that is. And that's our spiritual birthright. You don't have to be this prophet of old. People that experience God directly are not unusual. There's nothing unusual about them. The only thing that is unusual about them is their set of values. They have learned the value, perhaps by some awakening, some sliver of light they saw come through the window in their own being, and they know that God is an inner presence. And so we pursue that, and it opens up to more and more and more. But we stop taking our cues from the intellect, and we start taking our cues from the intuition. That doesn't mean we stop using the intellect. The intellect is taught by the intuition, and this means that when you have your first experience with that little beam of sunlight, you learn from that. You know what the sun is. You know more about it from direct experience. That your intellect changes as the result of that experience. As I've said on another occasion, if you have two containers of water, one is hot and one is cold, somebody tells you one's hot and one's cold, well, you don't really know which one's which. You can't tell by looking at them. But you can instantly tell when you put your finger in, because you have a direct experience. You say the one on the right is a hot one. You know directly because you had that experience. And that's the kind of knowledge we want to have with God. We don't want to have something that's been passed down by the experts. That's what most of us have. Do you have faith? And what we're saying is, yes, I believe this set of doctrines that have been given to me, but I've never had an experience. I'll have that when I die. And hopefully it'll be a good one because I learned all this doctrine. And I lived by it. The doctrine has nothing to do with the direct experience, any more than the doctrine of the Son has to do with the experience of the Son. But we're so indoctrinated with that kind of thinking that we think that we're incomplete or we're incapable of experiencing the divine. We're expressions of the divine already. It's not something you have to earn. And that's the old traditional thinking. I've got to earn the right to be with God. And so I practice all these things. Try to be a good Christian and good whatever, Muslim or whatever I'm trying to be. So I can be accepted. So I can get into the club. Heaven is treated like a gated community. You have to earn the right to get through the gate. And you have to remember one last password. And that would be heavenly. I only have to learn one more password and then I'm in. But what if that is all pressing in upon us? Now, what if the sun is fully shining right now outside of this building? And any one of us, we don't have to earn the right. We can simply walk through the doors and experience it. What if we started thinking that way? Then we would start experiencing it. We would start having firsthand experiences with God, and we would look at all of the religious stuff that's been set up with the eye of suspicion. We wouldn't need that anymore. And I think it's a good thing to have. It keeps a lot of people in line. But it also, as I say in one of my songs, it's the chain that binds my mind. And I'm able to break free of that by saying, I don't have to go through a church, I don't have to go through a priest, I don't have to go through anything. The kingdom of God is truly within me. Jesus, I think, understood what he was talking about. So let's not get hung up on language, on words. As I stand up here and speak, I have to use words. And you hear words, and we communicate in that way. What I cannot communicate is experience. I can simply encourage all of us by saying that which we are looking for is truly within us. And it's not that hard to find. It's just that we're looking through a whole set of preconceptions. We're sorting through all these things we've learned, trying to find God low here, low there. And we're sorting through our subconscious mind, as I call it, the storage shed. Instead of sitting in the chapel of the soul, we're looking for God in the storage facility, the storehouse of subconscious concepts. That's where we put them. And that's really the thing, that we have to do. It's not so much learning more information about God. It's about getting rid of what we carry around that isn't true. All the misconceptions I have about sunlight are false. Totally dispelled the instant I step outside. Okay. So the general understanding of Christ through unity, though unity treats the Christ as our spiritual core, the term has such historical and religious significance. Many may find it a barrier rather than a help to advancing their spiritual understanding. I didn't find it was a barrier, but people do, often do, and that's one thing I've heard over the 40 years I've been doing this. And I still will think Christ is, my mind goes back 2,000 years. And then I adjust. I remember. That's not what I mean. There's something else, something different, something closer to home. We want to make our spiritual journey ours. This is ours. You are an expression of God, and that process is just yours. It's like you are on a piece of beach, and the whole ocean is washing up on that beach. And you've been so trained to think your beach isn't worthy or something, and you're looking at somebody else's piece of beach. We're all on this beach with the ocean washing up on our shore. It's ours. It's our beach. But we have to make it ours. We have to get over the hurdle of thinking, I can't get this. I don't know. I'm not qualified. I'm not the expert. The only reason I think I have become an expert is because I had the experience of the ocean. And I know that it's washing on everyone's shore. It's no longer a set of concepts, but then you understand what the mystics were talking about. You understand the religious language, and you also understand the difference between an academic talking about spiritual things, about religious things, and a mystic who is actually speaking from that place, from that inner knowing. Jesus was one of those. People didn't get it. They were listening with the head. He was speaking from the heart. Do you have a spiritual core that responds to any name that you're comfortable with? I wouldn't call it George or Anne or... Don't have to have a name. Moses realized the name was I Am, and that's a pretty good name. It's a statement of being, that pure being that rises in all of us. Tennyson described it as closer is he than breathing and nearer than hands and feet. I think that's a pretty good description. It's not a description trying to encompass something. It is bringing the mind to the now, to this place here, this piece of beach, this beam of sunlight. The location of your spiritual core is fixed. The name you choose is yours to decide. I don't call it anything. I refer to it as the soul just because I think that's what most people think of when they think of their eternal nature. It's kind of an old word. It's a very old word, actually. It actually means breath, breath of the Almighty. You know, that's the idea. And I like that too. But then when I think of the Almighty, what do I think of? This big old guy blowing hot air, and I'm part of the hot air of God. So it's just something that we all, put everything on the table and say, I don't know all of this stuff, but something in me knows. I'm standing on a beach. The ocean is washing up on my shore at this very moment. Look at that. How do I know that? How do I experience that? How do I make that mine, get out of my head and down to my experience, intuitive heart? That's the question we ask ourselves. And we can, look at other people's spot on the beach for the rest of our life if we want to. But you've got your own. And that's a very important thing to get when it comes to your spiritual development. All right. Thanks for coming out, and we'll do this again next week.